We're going to begin our discussion of Chapter 1 with an introduction to the human body. So in each of your video lectures, you're going to see some information at the beginning about what the chapter is going to cover and some big ideas of what you should learn throughout this chapter. So we'll start by discussing what is anatomy and physiology. Anatomy is the study of the human body, and physiology is the study of how body parts function. So if you're looking at your teeth and you notice their shape, you are looking at their anatomy. If you take those same teeth and you think about the job that they do and how they do it, you're looking at how they function, so their physiology. Most of the time you're going to see that these two go very closely hand in hand, and the anatomy determines the physiology. Think again about your teeth. Think about the way that your front teeth have that sharp chisel shape so that you can bite things off. And think about your back teeth. Your molars have those flat grinding surfaces. They're made to do a specific job, and their location in the body helps them to do that job. Another example, think about your fingers. You use your fingers to grasp, to touch, to pick things up, to write, to type, to do all the things that you do with your hands and your fingers. Think about how they are made. They're made a specific way so that they can do specific jobs. What if they were located on your head instead of at the end of your arms? Then the anatomy and the physiology would no longer be neatly paired together. So it's my hope as we continue to move through the chapters that we'll cover this semester that you learn to appreciate and to be amazed about that human body that you have. All right, so now that you know what anatomy and physiology is all about, we'll look at some examples of selected branches of anatomy and physiology. So looking at anatomy first, embryology. You've all heard the term embryo, and of course that's part of our development. So embryology, ology means the study of, embry refers to the embryo. Developmental biology studies the way that an individual develops from the time that the sperm fertilizes the egg until the time of their death. Cell biology, well, that one's pretty self-explanatory, huh? So cell biology studies cell structure and function. Histo refers to tissue, so histology is the study of tissues. So using tools known as microscopes, we can look at the structure of tissues. And gross anatomy is the study of something that you can see without using a microscope, so body parts that you can observe. We sometimes classify the branches of anatomy into groups. Systemic anatomy looks at specific body systems, such as the nervous system or respiratory system, which would look at things that are disorders with nerves, with nervous tissue, or with the lungs and the breathing mechanism. Regional anatomy, studying specific parts of the body, such as looking at the head or the chest or the arms or the foot. Surface anatomy is when you use things that you can see on the outside of the body to understand what's going on inside the body. So there are landmarks located all over the body that are used for palpation, which means to touch, or to listen with a stethoscope, that's known as auscultation. And by using particular areas on the body, you can get an idea of what's going on underneath. For instance, if the doctor is listening to your chest with a stethoscope, they may be listening to the way that your heart is beating. They may be listening for whether or not the valves of your heart are closing properly and allowing the blood to flow as it should. Or they could be listening to your lungs and listening with that stethoscope. They can hear if there are rattles or if perhaps there's fluid built up because your breathing sounds don't sound right. And all of that is done at specific spots on surface anatomy on the outside of the body so that they can best hear or feel what they're trying to detect inside the body. Imaging anatomy uses techniques that give us an image inside the body, such as x-rays, MRIs, and different types of scans. At the end of this chapter, I've included several slides that have some examples of different imaging techniques. Those imaging techniques are not going to be something that are tested because they do get pretty in-depth, but it gives some pretty cool pictures and some explanations for some of these tests and things that you may see throughout your academic studies and also just in everyday life and when you visit your doctor. Okay, and pathological anatomy, patho means disease. So pathological anatomy is looking at things that change in the body, in the tissues, in the cells, in the organs, in the way that they look. So we're looking at changes to the anatomy that are associated with those disease states. Some examples of physiology branches of study. Molecular physiology looks at the individual molecules found within the body, such as the proteins that make up many of our body structures and our DNA, which is a structural molecule. Neurophysiology, neuro refers to nerve, so we're looking at the function of those nerve cells and the nervous tissue and how they perform their jobs and disorders associated with those. Endocrinology, endo means within and crin is secretion. So endocrinology is looking at the secretion of hormones, which are chemical messengers in the body that cause actions to happen. So looking at how those hormones control and regulate body functions. For instance, if you have diabetes, the two common types, type 1 and type 2 diabetes that are related to blood sugar, you will probably see an endocrinologist who is a physician that specializes in endocrine disorders. Cardiovascular physiology, cardi refers to heart and vascular refers to the blood vessels. So a cardiovascular physician would be someone who studies and treats patients for disorders or assessing the function of the heart and the blood vessels. Continuing with branches of physiology, immune. Okay, so if you're immune to something, you're not susceptible to getting that. So if you receive an injection for the chicken pox, that gives you an immunity to chicken pox. So immunology is the study of the way that the body defends you from things that could cause you to be sick, such as the chicken pox virus. Respiratory physiology, respire is to breathe. So respiratory physiology looks at the function of the air passageways, the lungs, and how we exchange gases across some of those structures that we'll learn. Renal, ren refers to kidneys, so renal physiology studies the function of the kidneys and how they filter the blood, and in the process of doing so, create urine. Exercise physiology looks at the changes in the body due to muscular activity, such as when you move, your muscles contract, and if you move repetitively and you have resistance against that movement, such as if you're lifting weights or you're running, then the muscular activity can cause changes in the way those cells and organs function. And pathophysiology, remember we looked at pathology just a minute ago with pathological anatomy. Pathophysiology looks at the functional changes associated with disease processes and the normal aging. All right, so now that we've looked a little bit at some of the different areas of anatomy and physiology, let's see if we can figure out how this body of ours is put together. So I want you to think back when you first started learning how to read. Before you could learn what words were, you had to learn about letters. So we can use an analogy related to those letters and words to think about structural anatomy of the human body. So if we look at the atoms that make up the human body, those are like the letters that we first learned when we were learning to read. So we had to learn A, B, C, D, and so on before we could start putting CAT together to form words. And then once we learned words, we learned how to read sentences, and from sentences to paragraphs, and paragraphs to chapters, and chapters to books, right? But it all started with those smallest little pieces, those letters that we had to put together to make words. So the chemical level of human structure, again, is like those letters that we first start out with. So atoms would represent the letters if we go back to the reading analogy. So atoms are the tiny little structures found within the human body that come together to form larger structures known as molecules. Molecules then assemble into structures known as cells. Cells are the smallest structural functional parts of the human body. So cells have all the characteristics that a living person does, and we'll look at some of those shortly. Cells come together to form tissues, such as muscle cells come together to form a muscle tissue, and then muscles and other tissues, such as epithelial tissues and connective tissues, all come together to form organs. So organs are specific parts of the body that have specific jobs. So if you think about, you've got muscle cells that come together to make muscles, to make the muscle tissue. Then you've got muscle tissue, and you've got tissues that surround the stomach, and you've got mucus layers inside the stomach, and you've got connective tissues holding the stomach in place and forming coverings. So all of that's made up of many different types of tissue that's made up of many different types of cells that are made up of molecules that are made up of atoms. Starting to get the picture? All right, so when you have organs doing specific jobs, they typically work with other organs to carry out a systemic job or become a system. So if we go back to thinking about the stomach is a part of the digestive system. Well, not only is it the stomach, but the mouth and the salivary glands and the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the pancreas, the liver, the gallbladder, the small intestine, large intestine. All of these are organs that work with the stomach at the system level. So they create an organ system. The human body is composed of many organ systems that all work together to form a functional organism that we call a human. All right, so that gives you sort of an overview there. Remember, I just mentioned we have these organ systems that all work together to make sure that we carry out all the functions of life. So we're going to look at 11 different systems. And for these systems, I want you to know their basic function and some of the main organs found within each of these systems. The integumentary system is what we commonly call the skin, but it's not just this outer covering that protects the body. Your hair and your fingernails and toenails, sweat glands and oil glands, all of this are part of the integumentary system. So these are structures that are a part of the skin and some of them inside the skin. So the main function, of course, is to protect the body and to help regulate body temperature. But the sweat glands also help to get rid of waste. There are cells in the skin that help us to make vitamin D. That's going to be important in calcium, and we'll talk about that much more as the semester progresses. Within the skin, we have receptors, that nervous tissue receptors that detect things such as touch and pain, changes in temperature, and also within the skin we store fat, and that helps to provide some insulation and help us to keep that temperature regulated. The skeletal system is made up of bones and joints. So joints are where bone meets bone, and we have some movement between most of our joints, and also the cartilage that's associated with those bones and those joints. So when you think about the skeletal system, the bones of the skull and your femur, your ribs, your vertebrae, all of those are organs of the skeletal system. So they protect and support the body. They provide attachment areas for muscles so that when those muscles contract, the body can move. Also, one of the important functions of bone is that that's where we have these stem cells that create our blood cells and keeps us a continuous supply of nice fresh blood cells. And we store minerals such as calcium and phosphates in the bone, and also some fat tissue in there as well in the bone marrow. So on the next slide here, you see just a representation of each of the two systems we just talked about. So the integumentary system, of course, the outer covering of the skin, the fingernails and the toenails and the hair, And what you can't see on this, of course, are the small little glands and nerve receptors that are a part of the skin. The skeletal system, you see here the bones of the human body. So when we start studying bones, we'll name all these bones and learn different pieces and parts of them. But here a common bone that everyone knows is the femur. And then we've got the radius and the ulna and the humerus and the ribs and the vertebrae and the bones of the skull. All of these individual bones make up the organs of the skeletal system. Here you've got the elbow joint, the hip joint, the knee joint, and you can also see some little light colored blue areas in here. These are showing you some of the cartilaginous structures that are associated with bones. Next, we'll look at the muscular system. So the muscular system has three different types of muscle. There's skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle helps to move the body around. So this is your voluntary muscle. So if you contract your biceps brachii to show your muscles of your upper arm, those are skeletal muscles. So these are the muscles that are usually attached to bone. But we also have smooth muscle that lines organs and helps to move things throughout the body, and cardiac muscle, which is found only in the heart. So muscle function is to contract. When muscle contracts, it causes something to happen, such as moving the body around or moving something within the body. When we walk, we stand upright, we move around. All of that requires muscles to contract. And when they contract, they're breaking chemical bonds, and that releases heat. So if you think when you're cold, what do? Your body starts to shiver. When you're shivering, those are small little muscle contractions, and those contractions are releasing heat. The nervous system main components are the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves, but also special sensory organs such as the eyes and the ears and the nose that we'll look at near the end of the semester. The function of the nervous system is to control and coordinate the body using action potentials or nerve impulses. The nervous system detects changes both inside and outside the body, interprets those changes, and then causes a response as a result of those changes. So here we can see some of the components of the muscular system. So here we've got a pectoralis muscle and an abdominal muscle. We've got our quadriceps group and your deltoid. All of those are individual muscles, are individual organs of the muscular system. Attached to those, we have tendons, that's connective tissue, that are going to attach those muscles to bones and allow us to move. The nervous system, you can see the brain, the spinal cord, and all these little yellow stringy things coming off are peripheral nerves. Those nerves are the ones that go out to the body and come back from the body and bring that stimulus into the spinal cord and the brain so that we can interpret those sensations and cause an action to occur if we need to. The endocrine system is the system of glands within the human body that secrete hormones. Hormones, again, are chemical messengers that travel through the bloodstream and bind to target cells and tissues and then cause an action to occur. So they regulate activities within the human body. Insulin is a very common hormone that most people have heard of, whether they knew it was a hormone or not. So insulin's job is to be released. So the pancreas releases insulin when your blood sugar goes up. That insulin then travels out to body cells, binds to those cells, and causes them to take sugar out of the blood and into those body cells. Okay, so it lowers blood sugar. All of that is a result of the endocrine system, specifically the gland known as the pancreas. The cardiovascular system main components are the heart, the blood, and the blood vessels that carry the blood to and from the body. So the heart pumps blood out through blood vessels, and arteries carry oxygenated blood out to body tissues so that those body tissues can use that oxygen to create energy. Also, the blood is going to transport hormones and nutrients and proteins and all kinds of amazing things that we're going to learn about out to body tissues, and then brings waste products back to the heart and to the lungs and to the kidneys so that we can filter it out of the blood and get rid of it. All right, so here we see some of the main organs of these two systems. Within the brain, you have the hypothalamus, which is the body's chemist that causes a lot of different things to happen, such as regulating other glands to secrete hormones and changes your blood pressure. So we'll learn lots about that when we get into the nervous system. And your pineal gland and pituitary gland, your thyroid. Your thyroid gland helps to regulate your metabolism, your parathyroid glands, your adrenal glands, and your pancreas, and in the reproductive organs, the testes and the ovaries in the female, or the testes in the male and the ovaries in the female. So all of these secrete hormones that travel through the blood out to targets and cause changes to occur. Here we see the cardiovascular system, so you can see the heart, which is a double-sided pump. It's going to pump blood out to the lungs to get oxygen and drop off waste products such as CO2, and then it comes back to the heart, and the heart pumps again out the other side, the left side, into all of these blood vessels. So out through the arteries, down into body structures, and then the veins bring that blood right back to the heart, and the cycle continues. The lymphatic system is also coupled with the immune system. So you've got lymphatic fluid known as lymph and the vessels that carry it. The lymphatic system's job is to return fluids from the body back to the cardiovascular system, back into the blood. The spleen, the thymus, the lymph nodes, and the tonsils, their function is basically to protect the body. So you've got large groups of immune system cells that are found in these organs. And those immune system cells are basically the army that fights your body or fights for your body to make sure that invaders, pathogens, disease-causing bacteria and viruses don't get in and make you sick. The respiratory system, primary organs are the lungs and the air passageways, such as the pharynx and the larynx and the trachea, and the bronchial tubes that go into and out of the lungs. Now, I want to pause here for a moment. You heard me say pharynx and larynx, right? I didn't say pharynx and I didn't say larynx because you don't have one. It's a very, very commonly mispronounced words. Most people will say pharynx and larynx. Well, don't be one of those people because you don't have them. You have a pharynx and a larynx. All right, so the functions of the respiratory system are gas exchange. So bringing oxygen into the body and exhaling CO2 from the body. Also helps to regulate acid-base balance and to cause sounds, as our vocal cords that are housed in our larynx have air moving across them. Again, we'll study more about this as we continue to go through. Here we can see some of the primary organs of the lymphatic system and the respiratory system. So there's our thymus, and here you can see 3 sets of tonsils. Bet you didn't know you had 3 sets, huh? So the pharyngeals are the ones that we commonly call the adenoids, and then you have the palatine tonsils. Those are the ones that get inflamed so easily and the ones that are most commonly removed during a tonsillectomy. And then we have lingual tonsils. Lingual means tongue. So these are associated with the root or the base of the tongue. Here we've got the spleen, and you can see thoracic ducts that are part of the lymphatic vessels. And all these teeny tiny little green bean looking things are lymph nodes. So all these vessels are going to collect fluid from body tissues, run it back through these lymph nodes, which clean it up sort of like coffee filters do, and allow that fluid to be clean when it's restored back into the cardiovascular system. The respiratory system begins with the nasal cavity, so we bring air into the nasal cavity, and the oral cavity is also considered part of the respiratory system because we do inhale and exhale sometimes through the oral cavity as well. The pharynx is what we commonly call the throat. The larynx is what we call the voice box, and then the trachea begins where the larynx ends, comes down and branches into primary bronchi and smaller bronchioles that go out into the right and left lungs where we have that gas exchange. All right, digestive system. This one most people are pretty familiar with. So the organs of the gastrointestinal tract. So we've got the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, which is the tube that food goes through, the stomach, the small and large intestines, the rectum, the anus, the accessory organs such as the salivary glands and the liver and gallbladder and the pancreas. So the salivary glands secrete saliva that helps to lubricate and has some chemicals in it that help us to begin digestion. The liver makes bile and the gallbladder secretes it, and the pancreas secretes enzymes that help us break down our food. So what's the function? Physical and chemical breakdown of food. So using chemicals and using the teeth and the mouth to break down food so we can get it into its smallest components and absorb those nutrients and then get rid of any remaining waste products that we can't use. The urinary system, the main components are the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. So the job of the kidneys is to filter the blood. As it does so, it creates waste products and gets rid of excess water in the body, so helps us to maintain a fluid and mineral balance. So the kidneys filter, and then the fluid comes down the ureters and fills the urinary bladder. And the urinary bladder is then emptied to the external environment through the urethra. So here we can see the main organs as we saw a while ago, or we talked about a while ago, the mouth and the pharynx, the salivary glands and the esophagus, the liver, and then you can see a tiny little bit of the gallbladder. There's the stomach, and the pancreas is behind the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. The large intestine straightens out to become the rectum. Rect means straight. So the straight part of the tube is the rectum, and then the opening to the external environment is the anus. The urinary systems, here we have the kidneys, okay, and the two little tubular structures that empty the kidneys are the ureters, which fill the urinary bladder that's emptied through the urethra. All right, so the last system we're going to cover is the reproductive system. The reproductive system is responsible for creating cells that allow the human body to create new organisms. So the primary organs in the male are the testes. The primary organs in the female are the ovaries. Now, not the penis, not the vagina. You can reproduce without those, but you can't reproduce without sperm cells and egg cells, and those are created in the testes, sperm cells created for the male, and the ovaries create egg cells in the female. So those organs are what we call gonads. Yes, ladies, you have gonads. The ovaries are gonads, the testes are gonads. So those are the organs that create the sex cells that must be present in order for reproduction to occur. They also secrete numerous hormones that we'll learn about that help us to become sexually mature and to maintain the appearance of a male versus a female. So other organs associated with these, you have the mammary glands that produce milk to feed the young. You have the ovaries and the fallopian tubes. So the eggs are created in the ovaries. They travel through the fallopian tubes. If fertilization occurs, then development occurs in the uterus. And then you've got the vaginal canal. What else do we have here? We'll learn much more about these structures as we are looking at these particular systems. And in the male, you have the testes, which are outside of the abdominal pelvic cavity. Sperm cells are actually formed better at lower temperatures. That's why the scrotum houses the testes outside of the body. So the testes are the primary organs, and then the vas deferens, which is a tubular structure that travels to the prostate gland, which releases secretions that are a part of the seminal fluid. Then the penis, of course, which is the copulatory organ that deposits sperm cells into the vaginal canal. All right, more on all of that to come later. So I believe this is where we'll stop this particular video, and we'll pick back up with more of Chapter 1 in the next video.